This is a video produced by the Jadaliyya Environment page. We interviewed Dr. Mazin Qumsiyeh, founder and director of the Palestine Institute for Biodiversity and Sustainability and the Palestine Museum of Natural History, based at Bethlehem University in the West Bank. We reached Dr. Qumsiyeh in Bethlehem to discuss the work of the Institute and the museum in the context of environmental challenges in Palestine. This video contains excerpts from our interview.
Thank you for that, Mazin. And as you know, I had the opportunity to visit the Palestine Institute for Biodiversity and Sustainability and the Palestine Museum of Natural History last fall. As we mentioned, you are the director and founder of these institutions. And one of the words that's often used to describe the site that you've created in Bethlehem and the community of staff, volunteers, fauna, and flora that inhabit it is oasis. And it's striking to view the historical objects and agricultural tools that you've put on display, particularly for the Palestine ethnography exhibit. I believe at last count you had 123 objects and more than 130 books on cultural heritage. And this is really such a monumental achievement, especially considering how an exhibit like this is fighting against the current in terms of efforts towards the erasure of Palestinian history and memory. So I was wondering if you would tell us a bit more about what led you to start the Institute and the museum and why this idea of the site as an oasis is so important in the context of occupation in which Palestinians' access to their own land and natural resources is severely restricted.
I mean, on a personal level, I was born here, obviously, and my grandparents, my parents are people very simple, were very poor families that we started out with. I had an uncle who loved nature, and he got his PhD in zoology from the US, actually, from the University of Connecticut. And as a child, he used to take me to the fields. My mother used to take me to the fields, show me the medicinal plants, the herbal plants, things that we can and things that we can't eat from nature. So I learned to love nature, and as I grew up, I realized how lucky I was to be born in such a place. This is, after all, the Fertile Crescent. This is where humans first developed agriculture. Also, Palestine is an intersection of continents. Even humans migrated out of Africa to the rest of the world through Palestine. So we have this very rich habitat, rich nature, which allowed us to be the first people who invented agriculture some 11, 12,000 years ago. That's why we also have the oldest continuously inhabited town on earth, which is Jericho. So we are lucky in that regard. And and I look at what's my role in life. My role in life is to try and preserve something of our heritage, of our past, because as you pointed out, it's under assault. So this assault on our culture and our history is ongoing and is meticulous and is beyond the words that I can express to explain how devastating it is, and how every aspect of our lives is controlled. And our life, I mean, the people who remained here, of course, most Palestinians are refugees or displaced people. 7.5 million of us are refugees or displaced people. So for those of us who remain, what is our duty? Our duty is to try, against all odds, if you want, to preserve this, to maintain this, to document this, to publish on this. And that's what we do. So when I started this Institute of Biodiversity and Sustainability, with a garden around it and a museum of natural history that preserves the natural history, but also cultural history. We have actually hundreds now of old agricultural instruments and other things, but also preserving the intangible cultural heritage, the words, the language. Palestinian language is still, a lot of it is Canaanitic Aramaic language, not all Arabic words. About 20% of the language is actually Aramaic words that we use in common speech. So to preserve all of this, to research it, to document it, is the first task of this museum, is basically research, and second is education, and third is conservation. And you have to do it in that order.
As a follow-up, could you actually describe to us the process behind locating, acquiring, curating these artifacts in order to display them at the museum? It seems like, you've mentioned the research, but it seems like it's actually not been that easy and straightforward to actually preserve these artifacts.
I mean, museums in general are basically the storage cabinet of people that they keep the mementos, things that they value. So in our museum, it's not just, of course, human artifacts, but also plants and animals. We get animals who are killed or dead on the road, things like that. We preserve them. We have taxidermy species of animals. We collect insects. We display the butterflies, for example, of Palestine. We look at medicinal plants and we press them and we show them to people and show what can be done with these things, herbal plants, seeds. And then there's the artifacts that humans make, and that is also very valuable. For example, old agricultural instruments. We have old beehives, for example. They used to make them from straw and mud and things like that. And it shows, again, that we have this long, continuous, and really uninterrupted history of living in relative harmony with nature. I mean, humans today are much more destructive than our ancestors. I mean, my grandfather, for example, had a farm, but he never produced any so-called waste or solid waste or anything like that. They never used plastic. Everything was recycled, compost, things like that. So what we try to do basically here is demonstrate to everybody, and this is not intended just for outsiders or whatever, it's for ourselves. And if you're a refugee after a generation or two generations, you may start to lose even the language of agriculture that you use in a common day life. So it's important for us to teach our children about what is this heritage, where did we come from. And this is very empowering and makes people feel better and they enjoy it. So our primary audience is really our own people, to liberate our minds from mental colonization. As Stephen Biko once said, the best weapon in the hand of the occupier is the mind of the occupied, or the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed.
You've painted this really powerful picture of the challenging, to say the least, context in which your work is situated. And I did want to turn for a moment to your work as a scientist and the ways in which the research you're doing is complemented by and works in tandem with these efforts with resistance and education. Specifically, I wanted to ask about research you've published documenting an industrial Israeli settlement in the West Bank that has been dumping toxic waste on Palestinian communities. And in particular, you've written about how toxic exposure is impacting Palestinians living in the village of Brukin, close to Israel's Barkan Industrial Park. And on a different but related note still, organizations, such as B'Tselem have published research highlighting the reality that a very significant portion of Israel's waste treatment system is located in the West Bank. And I know from my own work on water access and environmental justice in the West Bank, it's striking to actually be there. And when you see for the first time the close proximity of Palestinian communities and settlements and the lack of mobility, of course, that many Palestinians are dealing with due to the separation wall and the occupation more broadly. So could you speak about the various ways that Palestinians do encounter toxic waste and the health impacts that this is believed to have on residents of the affected communities?
Right. Yes, it's a very important subject, and it concerned me significantly since I came back from the US, because I used to work in medical schools in the US. I was teaching in medical schools, doing clinical work at the Duke University, and then Yale University. And my interest in human health is because again, I don't differentiate. Humans are part of nature, native people are part of nature, and environmental health and human health are interconnected. So to study this, I teach in a master program in biotechnology. It's shared between Bethlehem University and Polytechnic University in Hebron. And this joint master program, I got to, suggest to them some projects to look at environmental health and human health. And one of those students decided to do her master thesis on that Barkan industrial settlement, which includes something like 45 industries that are the most polluting industries, like leather and weapons and things like that, and dumping this toxic waste on the 3 villages nearby, including Kufr Dik and Brooklyn. So for her thesis, she looked at the people of Brooklyn who complained of the smells and the contamination of the water. And she took samples of blood from them and compared them with the control site to look at DNA damage and chromosome breaks. And we did see significant chromosome breaks and DNA damage, which are, as you know, predisposed to a lot of conditions, including cancers, congenital birth defects, and other things, infertility, and so on. And indeed, we see these health effects also with health statistics, but by directly examining the blood for the first time, actually, and we can demonstrate scientifically with a double-blind study with controlled samples that basically there is an effect on human health, direct effect of these pollutants on human health. And there were since other students of mine who did similar kind of research on effect of Israeli industrial settlements. Israeli residential settlements even have population health effects. Residential settlements near here, Bethlehem, for example, a residential settlement where I was in Wadi Fukin recently, and the residential settlements dumped their sewage on the Palestinian village of Wadi Fukin. And the fresh water is contaminated in that village, and that obviously has health effects, but also effects on the fauna and flora, on the wildlife of the area.
This is a good moment to kind of also zoom out a little bit and, kind of think about what climate change is doing in particular to Palestinians. While we understand climate change is an existential threat to all of humanity, in your work, you discuss how it poses particular threats to Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, especially given the severe challenges that Palestinians face regarding restrictions on water access, exposure to toxic pollutants, and limited access to the resources that are needed to adapt to climate change. These are all things you've just touched upon. I just was wondering what your thoughts are on what exactly Palestinians are up against in terms of facing the climate crisis in the context of both the occupation and the blockade.
Climate change, as you know, is produced mostly by Western powers who use most of the fossil fuel and so on. Palestine contributes negligible amounts, for example, to global greenhouses gases. I think, there is estimates here, computer models, that temperature will rise by about 4 degrees centigrade, and rainfall will drop by 20-25% in the next 20 years. So I think it's very important that we recognize this effect and we understand this effect and we try to deal with it. And mitigate is what the words that they use, but mitigate and ameliorate the effect, of course. I mean, we still try to encourage people here not to use cars and not to use plastics, and we have educational programs about this. But this is, what we have to do is really also adapt to the reality that we may not succeed. And certainly Palestine, as I said, there's an impact on the world. Climate change is not significant. So we need to work on the global level on climate change. And that's why, we created a group here called Palestine Action for the Planet, to try and affect some change in that behavior globally. And a lot of my emails to my lists, I speak about environmental issues. But I think this is a global threat, and I think humanity, Homo sapiens, misnamed maybe, or maybe Linnaeus was optimistic when he named us Homo sapiens. I'm not sure, but anyways, Homo sapiens could go extinct in the next few decades, or much shorter than that if we don't get our act together. And not just because of climate change alone, we have also the threat of nuclear weapons and other things. Pandemics now obviously is a threat. And the way the world deals with such things is showing that we have a system that's not working. I mean, when you have a country the size of the US not able to handle a pandemic like COVID-19, it shows us the limitations.
Thank you for that information. I did want to ask you, because in the Institute's annual reports, you've written about green building plans, and I've seen some of the structures that you do have on the site. And I was wondering if you wanted to just briefly touch on that approach that you have of sustainable building works in tandem with making use of existing structures, just thinking about how that kind of work, and also how adaptation to climate change, as you've already said, is a unique challenge in the context of occupation and blockade, and that even if the will and the ability and the talent is there, that the context itself actually prevents a lot of these efforts from being carried out.
Yeah, I mean, I think, that adage of think globally and act locally certainly applies. We each should look at our own actions and what we can do and how we can affect a positive change. There's a lot of negative energy in this world. There's a lot of environmental destruction, a lot of warmongering. We still spend trillions on weapons we already have more weapons that could destroy this planet 10 times over. So the question is really, what is it that I as an individual can do, or we as a community can do? And when Huma mentioned that we consider about how we can structure our lives and what we can do to affect this, well, what is it that we can do at the Palestine Institute of Biodiversity and Sustainability? The museum is an educational feature. The buildings have to be educational features too. We have to use recycled material. We actually have a community garden that people can come and plant and grow vegetables. We have a lot. Even tonight we had some stuff from the garden, So how to be food self-sufficient, how to be environmentally friendly in all our activities as humans, how to reduce our waste, how to build things. So our vision is of a green building is within that context. The real issue is, of course, all of this costs a lot of money and people and resources, and so we always seek volunteers, international volunteers. We welcome them. Of course, now travel is restricted, but hopefully it'll open up again. We can do a lot as humans, but we need to work hard, basically.
Following from the points you just made, as you've emphasized, a core part of the Institute's work is education. And you've highlighted, in particular, in your reports and on the website recent efforts to foster children's education that have included an app in Arabic about Palestinian cultural heritage related to nature and agriculture, as well as, of course, numerous trainings and workshops and site visits. And in 2019, you reported that more than half of your visitors, I believe, were school-age children. And I think you've made this important point that you do this wonderful outreach work to educate international visitors and people who want to be more informed and engaged in what you're doing, but also, obviously, you are based in Bethlehem and you're working within that community. So could you speak about why you believe that education about the environment in Palestine is such a vital part of not only youth empowerment, as you've suggested, but Palestinian resistant efforts more broadly?
Right. I mean, I think when we think about what is the ideal world we look for sustainable communities, sustainable human communities, sustainable natural communities. And to get to that level of sustainability in humans' interactions with nature so that we are all living together comfortably and we're not destroying nature and we're not destroying each other, the motto of the museum is basically respect for ourselves as Palestinians, then respect for other human beings, then respect for nature. And these three levels of respects are very important and very significant for this issue of sustainability. So education comes into showing people the interconnectedness of these things. And people are sometimes surprised about how things they thought were different or disconnected are actually connected. I mean, just to use a more relevant example from today, the COVID-19. Why is there deaths in northern Italy more than southern Italy? Because there's pollution in northern Italy. Because there's much higher levels of pollution. So the people's immune system is compromised. So when you talk to people about these connections, they start, it clicks, something clicks about them. And this is what I mean by education. I don't mean by education a lecture to people or giving them information. It's showing them these connectivity, to allow them to connect the dots in a way that they can start to understand the value of sustainability for themselves. And this is healthy for them and eventually benefits them as individuals and in their own environment. When you show them that when you go in the woods and you breathe good oxygen, you are actually healthier, you're more likely to survive any infection than if you are not. So I think these are the kinds of things that we try to show them via, not via lectures, but via workshops, interactions, questions and answers, and object-based learning, hence a museum, it's object-based learning. This is the idea that we try to implement with education, which then leads to the third pillar. I mentioned research, education, conservation. The third pillar is the conservation, sustainability, sustainable agriculture, sustainable livelihood, etc.
To learn more about the Palestine Institute for Biodiversity and Sustainability and the Palestine Museum of Natural History, visit palestinenature.org. You can reach the Jadaliyya Environment page editors at environment@jadaliyya.com.